All right, so we're going to look at two Elizabeth Bishop poems, The Armadillo and The Fish. We're going to look at The Armadillo first, dedicated to Robert Lowell, um, but not really a direct response to Skunk Hour. There's a lot going on in this piece. We'll talk a little bit about some of the rhyme and the conceit, right, which is an extended metaphor, remember, that kind of runs through the whole thing at the end, and then we will discuss why our final stanza is in italics. But I'll read the Armadillo because I don't believe I put a recording of it up. So, the Armadillo for Robert Lowell. This is the time of year when almost every night the frail illegal fire balloons appear, climbing the mountain height, rising toward a saint still honored in these parts. The paper chambers flush and fill with light that comes and goes like hearts. Once up against the sky, it's hard to tell them from the stars, planets, that is, the tinted ones, Venus going down, or Mars, or the pale green one. With the wind they flare and falter, wobble and toss. But if it's still, they steer between the kite sticks of the Southern Cross, receding, dwindling, solemnly and steadily forsaking us, or, in the downdraft from a peak, suddenly turning dangerous. Last night another big one fell. It splattered like an egg of fire against the cliff behind the house. The flames ran down. We saw the pair of owls who nest there flying up and up, their whirling black and white stained bright pink beneath until they shrieked up out of sight. The ancient owl's nest must have burned. Hastily, all alone, a glistening armadillo left the scene, rose-flecked, head down, tail down, and then a baby rabbit jumped out, short-eared to our surprise. So soft, a handful of intangible ash with fixed, ignited eyes. Too pretty, dreamlike mimicry. Oh, falling fire and piercing cry, and panic in a weak mailed fist, clenched ignorant against the sky. So, at a kind of base literary level, this is a poem. It takes place on June 24th, St. John's Day. At the time, Bishop was living in Brazil. And on St. John's Day in Brazil, they send up all of these paper lanterns off into the hills, right? And there's a giant cross on the hillside. And one of them goes down and ignites the hillside. And then we have, this list of animals, the owls, the armadillo, and the rabbit that have to suffer, for our kind of pretentious human displays, right? It doesn't seem to be a concern to the people setting the lanterns off into the sky, but this is what Bishop seems to note. So first, let's talk about the form here. We have 6 quatrains, right? So 4-line stanzas, and we do have a rhyme scheme. Now it switches up a little bit. It's not exactly constant, but right, year, night, appear, height. So A, B, saint, parts, light, hearts, C, D. And then it kind of keeps that rhyme scheme moving. And it breaks down a little at the end, which makes sense because we kind of have, this eruption of violence and terror that these animals have to essentially suffer. So when thinking about form, at least rhyme and meter, when analyzing poetry, a good hint where something's supposed to happen, or there's a turn, right, or a volta, which is turn in Italian, or our author really wants us to take note of maybe a hint at a theme, right? They may break form in one way or another, and Bishop does this by the end. And then, of course, she also has the last stanza in italics, which we'll talk about when we get there. So, I mean, up until the point that we get to the animals, it's a lot of imagery and a lot of description, right? We're set in our place. We know that our speaker is watching this almost kind of like folk celebration, right? Because they're not supposed to be sending them off into the hills, probably for this exact same reason. But there is a theme of kind of human ignorance towards nature and the destruction of nature that runs throughout this poem. And that destruction, again, really has to do with our, um, you know, selfishness and lack of thought about the world around us. Um, right, our speaker seems to be the only person observing and showing any concern for these animals. Um, so I have it splatted like an egg of fire, highlighted only because I think it's like a phenomenal description. If you've ever dropped an egg and just seen it like on the floor, right? This is kind of how this lantern hits the ground and just kind of like splats out into flame, and then that obviously erupts the hillside, right? And we have all these animals trying to scurry and scour away. Um, so we have the owls, right, stained bright pink underneath until they shrieked up out of sight. Why are they stained pink? Because they're burnt, right? Um, We have the armadillo, red flecked, rose flecked, head down, tail down, right? Again, because it's burnt. Probably the worst description. We have the baby rabbit that's short eared, to our surprise. Why is it short eared? Its ears burned off. So it's this pretty brutal description of what's happened to all these creatures. And then we have the end, too pretty, dreamlike mimicry, right? So, you know, it's this beautiful scene that now doesn't seem real, right? So it's kind of mimicking a dream or a nightmare, rather, but it's a reality. So we've kind of turned here, and I'll discuss this big note in a second. But oh, falling fire and piercing cry and panic and a weak mailed fist, right? Which, if you look the note, is supposed to be the armadillo. Um, And this is the irony, right? This is a great example of situational irony. The armadillo is curled up to protect itself, but fire is, it can't protect itself in a ball from fire, which is why it is clenched ignorant against the sky, right? Um, Now, this note has to do with the other interpretation of this poem. So, in terms of checking out when things are written, right, this is 1965. So, um, right, post World War II, and we're into the Cold War, right? So, Soviet Union is testing atom bombs and has nuclear subs, and we're in the nuclear arms race now. And this would be the time, right, when, I mean, we've all had to do active shooter exercises in school. But back in the 50s and 60s, you would like prepare to get bombed. And supposedly all they really did, if they didn't have like a makeshift bunker, was like you'd get under your desks as if that's going to help. Um, but that's the other interpretation of this piece, right? Is that it is about this kind of penetrating fear of nuclear war. Um, and as, you know, these worshippers and people celebrating just ignorantly, let these paper flaming lanterns off into the hillside, they're not thinking about the repercussions of that action, right? And the repercussions of the action don't really affect them, but it destroys this landscape and arguably, we could say maims or probably kills some of these animals. We can assume the armadillo doesn't make it because it just curls up into a ball. right? Thinking that that will protect it. Um, Very much so, kind of like, hiding under a desk, thinking that if you get a bomb dropped on you, that that's going to do anything, especially a nuclear one. So, two big interpretations here. And again, you can check out that essay that I put up and see why actually it is dedicated to Lowell. But, you know, a little bit more formal, a little bit more structured than the last handful of pieces that we've looked at. Um, a lot of major themes, if you dig a little deeper, major as in large. You can take it at face value for what it is, which is totally fine. It's still, a beautiful and important piece. But then if you look at the big conceit about the arms race and the fear of potential nuclear destruction, there's more going on there, right? So, you can always pick pieces apart, find more meaning and metaphor than is actually clearly stated. Um, Later in life, Bishop did say that that was the underlying metaphor of this piece, which is kind of nice because it's not just some critic's interpretation, even though some critics got it right at the time. Um, so, yeah. Now, one of your reading response questions does involve the armadillo. Um, why do you think the armadillo is the title as opposed to the owl or the rabbit, right? Why particularly focus on an armadillo? And I hinted at that a little bit um, in this discussion, but keep that in mind, right? And don't relate it to Lowell and Skunk Hour because that's not the reason. So think about that. Now, the fish. Completely different, other than it involves an animal. Um, But I guess we haven't really talked about Elizabeth Bishop. In terms of confessional poets, it's very hard to pigeonhole Bishop into that movement in a clean way. Um, these obviously are not examples really of confessional poems. Now, the fish starts with an I, and remember, confessional poetry is the poetry of the I. But that's not to say that every poem that is in first person singular is a confessional poem. So don't make that mistake, right? Remember, it has to be like about deep emotions, and not to say that there isn't a ton of emotion in the end of this poem with all of the colors and the joy that she's caught this fish that has gotten away from so many uh, people fishing. Kind of, turns into this oil slick at the bottom of her boat that's shimmering like rainbows, right? Which is meant to kind of be a metaphor for, this like welling up of joy and emotion that she has until we get to the end. But I think it's more important when looking at these, and I know I also assigned at the fish houses, but this is just all description. Bishop was also a fairly accomplished painter. Um, So it might be wiser, as opposed to sticking her in completely with confessional poets, and kind of think of her like being a confessional poet outlier, right? Kind of on the borders of that movement. But I really think that a lot of her writing is informed by her outlook on the world as a visual artist, right? I mean, this is all beautiful description. And some of the description here, you could imagine, this as a painting of this like gnarly old kind of survivor of a fish, essentially, right? So it's free verse, right? There's no standard set rhyme or meter. You can kind of tell just by looking at it, right? Um, and honestly, it's just a ton of beautiful description and simile and metaphor up until the end, where things change a little, right? So again, she catches this fish, um, realizes that it has 5 hooks that have been like overgrown into it, so it's escaped 5 times before, and it's covered in barnacles and sea lice. Um, and she describes it physically, but then describes it physically from its insides, right? Which is an interesting idea, but which gets, kind of in her to her trying to understand this fish as a complete total being, right? She's even thinking about um, its coarse white flesh packed in like feathers and its bones, um, and the dramatic reds and blacks of its shiny entrails, right? So she's going, we could say, you know, she's going deeper, right, as we do when we pick apart pieces to look for a deeper meaning. She's going into this fish. Um, and again, just all description. And then we get back to the first person, right? I admired his sullen face, the mechanism of his jaw, and then I saw that from his lower lip, right, if you could call it a lip, grim, wet, and weapon-like, hung 5 old pieces of fish line. So this is where our speaker's emotion starts to come in, right? She starts to respect and venerate this fish. In a lot of ways, how Lowell, ends up respecting the mother skunk at the end of Skunk Hour, right? Because it will not scare, and it, stands up to him essentially, right? Who's trying to shoo it away, but it doesn't matter because it's on a mission and it's going to do what it wants. And Lowell is, respects that. And considering Lowell's state in Skunk Hour, he probably is a little jealous as well. But we have this respect for this fish at the end. Um, and all of a sudden, right, these hooks become metals, and the, you know, broken fishing line becomes ribbons, frayed and wavering, right? So it's this old beat up fish that, has these battle scars and wounds and medals to, display that it has survived and it has beaten so many people. Um, when we get down here, right, I stared and stared, and victory filled up the little rented boat. And then we have this metaphor here. From the pool of bilge where oil had spread a rainbow around the rusted engine, to the bailer rusted orange, the sun cracked thwarts, the oarlocks and their strings, the gunnels, right? So just a description of the inside of this boat, until everything was rainbow, 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 right? Um, you know, good bit of repetition right there, but it's supposed to elicit this kind of awe, right? Awe for this fish, but then also this sense of self pride that she has caught it, right? She's beaten all these other fishermen. Um, and then we have our last line, and I let the fish go. Now, Bishop wanted to cut that last line. Um, and she had sent this to Robert Lowell because they were very, you know, close friends, pen pals, and they shared and sent each other work that they were, still editing. And he implored her that she needed to keep the last line. Now, this is going to be your final reading response question. Why do you think Lowell thought that this poem needed the last line, and I let the fish go, to work, right? Because without it, it's a beautiful poem, right? Filled with great description. We have this welling of emotion at the end that kind of comes to a zenith with rainbow, rainbow, rainbow. But then she lets the fish go. So think about that.